Okay, good evening. I think we are ready to go. We should be live. I hope there's some sound coming through. I hope there's some movement on the screen. It looks like the GIFs are working. And so if somebody can let me know that you can hear me, I would very much appreciate that. We've got Peter and Heidi in the chat tonight. Thank you very much for being here. This is Nick, creator of Hayes Reviews, and we are back for part 2 of our reading of this Raymond B. Fosdick book, The Story of the Rockefeller Foundation. So we've done part 1. That was the introduction in the first chapter, and that was unexpectedly entertaining. And if you haven't seen that, you can have a look at the playlists tab on this channel, where you can see all the books that I've read through so far. And there's been some pretty good stuff. We've done a H.G. Wells book. We read Lusitania by Colin Simpson, which was incredibly tragic, but also eye-opening. We also read a Bertrand Russell book and The Romance of the Rothschilds. So we've got a pretty good thing going here, I think. And today we're cracking on with the Rockefeller Foundation. So it looks like people can hear me. Let's switch it over to the cam. Hello, good evening. I'm very happy that you can hear me. That is good. And welcome LJ and Richard and Gwen. Nice to have you all back again. Hope you're excited for this this chapter, because this was fun. I hope you've seen the first video. We spoke a little bit about Raymond B. Fosdick, the author. He was a president of the Rockefeller Foundation, but he was close to John D. Rockefeller Sr. and Jr., very close to the family. He was entrusted with the private papers and then given the task to write this book. And the first chapter was certainly, I can't say it was impartial and objective. It was very much bigging up John D. Rockefeller Sr. and talking about how industrious and generous and kind-hearted he was, and almost how he was cursed with his wealth and the amount of wealth that he had. It was just a burden because he just couldn't find ways to give it away. He just couldn't come up with enough charitable causes to sink his money into, and it was torturing him, and it was very tough. So an incredible sort of puff piece angle that we've read so far, and very, very much emphasizing the charitable, generous nature of this character and this family. Now, I'm sure many people who are here watching live now and will catch up on this video later will be familiar with the Rockefeller family and their legacy, and how they pop up time and time again in the truth and research and the alternative media community, because they had this overwhelming influence on the medical paradigms and the educational paradigms that we now find ourselves in. And so if we want to understand why things are happening in the present day, we need to go back in history and find out, well, who set up all these charitable philanthropic foundations, and who set up all these funds with money pouring into a variety of different influential organizations. And there is a money trail, and we can always follow the money and trace it back. And quite often this family, the Rockefeller family, they appear. And so we're reading this book because it's straight from the horse's mouth. As I mentioned, Raymond Fosdick, he was the president. And so this is kind of the official, in their own words, account of and the history of the foundation. And so it's worth, as a starting point at least, to understand this organization. Let's see what they had to say about themselves. Let's see what they admit to and confess to and own up to in their own words. And then we can kind of build out the picture from there. And so in the first episode of this series, I showed you all the other books that I have on this family, and there's a lot, and there's some big thick books. This area of my shelf up here, that's all Rockefeller. Big, thick books. So there's a lot to learn. And since that broadcast, people in my Telegram group, shout out to Bai, he's suggested more books that I should probably get hold of. The Rockefeller File by Gary Allen is one. But then also my own sort of reading and research has turned up a couple of books as well. And one of them is Frederick T. Gates's book, Chapters in My Life. And this book is super expensive. There's 3 copies of it on eBay, and they're all $200 or $300. And the front cover, maybe I can pull it up for you. Let's have a look. The front cover even says that he was kind of the Rockefeller whisperer. Yeah, I have it here. Okay, so let me just click a few buttons and make it so, in the immortal words of Captain Jean-Luc Picard. Not that one, this one. So this is Chapters in My Life by Frederick Taylor Gates. So what we learned in the first chapter was how closely this gentleman worked with John D. Rockefeller Sr. And this fellow was a Baptist, and his book, you can read here, the tagline says, "The autobiography of the man who was the confidential advisor to John D. Rockefeller Sr. and who shaped modern American philanthropy. Chapters in My Life." And you can see this copy here is $212. So it's about £166 in sterling. So, I mean, it's quite pricey, let's put it that way. And this looks like to be a 1977 copy. Oh, excuse me, just got a little frog in my throat there. But I would love to get my hands on this and read it. But it doesn't look like it's easy to find. I can't find any cheap copies floating around out there. So it seems to me, this tells me that there was probably something in this book, some insights, some admissions, some confessions maybe that the general population aren't supposed to know about. And I mean, this one we're reading tonight is fairly pricey. It wasn't when I managed to grab it, but Rockefeller Foundation, Fosdick, let's have a look, see what this is going for. Yeah, so I mean, you're looking at maybe 100 here, over 100. That looks like the American edition. There's a reasonably priced one, if anybody wanted to jump on that. 49. Well, I say reasonably priced. It's still 49 quid for a book. But yeah, there are. This one does have cheaper copies out there. But I'm going the wrong way. What am I doing? I'm in the wrong tab. That's why. There are cheaper copies of the one we're reading tonight. And there's reprints as well, which are a little bit cheaper. But this one, this Chapters in My Life book, that is not cheap. Sorry, I'm whizzing around all over the place here with different tabs. Very unprofessional. But yeah, look at that. That just tells me there's something in there that I want to know at least. So maybe there's a PDF floating around out there we can have a look at. Maybe I'll get some donations and be able to invest in a copy. But wouldn't it be interesting to have a look at that? Certainly would. And so the other one that popped up as I was doing a little digging, if I go back to Raymond Fosdick, is the general. So he did a book on the General Education Board as well. Let's see if we can pull that one up quickly. Adventure in Giving. Fantastic title. Look at this. So it's the same guy as we're reading. And this is Adventure in Giving, the story of the General Education Board. So the General Education Board was set up by the Rockefellers. And this one is, look at that, $398. So that would be another fantastic one to get our hands on and read. I'm sure you would agree. Because it's all about, well, what did they say in their own words? And then what do we actually know now? Now that the dust has settled, this was 1962. So now that the dust has settled, now that we can see the actual effects of all this philanthropic giving and all this kindness and loving generosity, and now that we've had 50, 60, 70 years of being able to watch what happened, we can compare that to what they say in their books about why they set it up, and would make for a very interesting study. I think you would agree. So there's a couple more books to put on your radar there, and maybe add to your electronic library, or maybe your physical library if you have the ways and the means. So how about that? So I thought I was pretty happy to have this one, and this was a rare one to get hold of, but there's even rarer books out there on this topic. So good stuff. What else before we get into the reading? Yeah, so today, I think, LJ, you just mentioned in the chat that you listened to me and Nigel Watson. So Nigel interviewed me. Nigel Watson invited me for an interview, and he posted that on his channel today. And I think that was a really fun conversation. I enjoyed it very much. So many topics, so many things to discuss. It was kind of a whistle-stop tour. We covered a lot of ground. And I think we enjoyed it, and hopefully at some point we'll set up another one. And so it was lovely to do that. My video feed was terrible, so you get kind of this kind of effect, but the audio was fine, so you can listen to it. But it's not the best footage of me if you want to, gaze into my eyes while I'm talking about how ridiculous and crazy the world is. But that was a lot of fun, and that's up on his channel now. And so if you want to check that out, it's about a 40-minute conversation or so. Just thought I'd mention that too. What else have we got? Oh, the other thing we're trying out tonight, and this is with our last episode. I did mention to people that I'd kind of built out the links in the description box, different ways to support and donate. One of the things we're trying out tonight is Entropy Stream. And this is a very small kind of grassroots streaming service. And they allow content creators to stream and also receive donations and super chats and this kind of thing. And they give you a host of different features where you can... so one of the things you can do is you can highlight people's comments. So I can click this, and then that comment at the top of the screen there, there's only me in there saying hello to myself at this point. But, we're trying to invest in the channel. We're trying to grow it and make it into something even better. And so there's new functionalities being added. And so I've just put that link in the chat. If anyone can just test it out, see if it works, that would be cool. Have a look. Entropy. I think they're trying to support the streamers and the voices and the content that are finding it difficult to make it on the big channels because of censorship, this kind of curtailing of our freedom of speech. And so it's worth knowing about them, supporting them, and checking them out if you feel so inclined. Okay, cool. So I think with a bit of preamble out of the way, we should get right into the book, shouldn't we? So yes, let's do that. Let's go over to the book cam. So the last chapter was really a massive introduction to Frederick T. Gates, and really painting this picture of the Rockefellers as just these... It didn't really go into where they got their wealth from. He didn't seem to want to mention that. He was just trying to belabor this point of how generous and giving and kind and wonderful. Now, one of the stories that goes around is that not Raymond Fosdick, that John D. Rockefeller Sr. hired a gentleman called Ivy Lee to reinvent his image. And there was a really good discussion about this going on in the Hayes Review's Telegram chat. And let me see if I can dig that up, because that is actually something worth mentioning. Because in this book, we read that he addressed this rumor or he called it a rumor. He addressed this rumor that the Rockefellers hired Ivy Lee to reinvent his image, to coach him because he didn't have a good reputation because of his oil monopoly, and they needed him to be seen as a giving person and a kind person, and Ivy Lee was the man to do that. But I'm struggling to find it. Oh, here we go. So what we found out is that Ivy Lee was hired in 1914, and AJ, a very awesome member of the Hayes Review's chat, he told us about this other event that happened. I should have prepared this beforehand, so bear with me while I'm clicking buttons. This other event that happened in 1914, which is called the Ludlow Massacre. Cheerful stuff. So let's go on to that quickly, and then we can carry on with the book. So we'll just go back over here. So this is the Ludlow Massacre. And so this happened in April 20th, 1914. And it's the same year that Ivy Lee was hired. And the idea was that we were discussing in the chat, AJ was suggesting that perhaps Ivy Lee was hired to manage the fallout of this event and to manage the perception of the Rockefellers after this event. And so I haven't actually been through this and read it in any detail, but it is there for you to have a look at. And we could have a little look here. So it was a mass killing perpetrated by anti-striker militia during the Colorado Coldfield War. Where does Rockefeller come into it? So here we go. John D. Rockefeller Jr., a part owner of CF&I, who had recently appeared before a United States congressional hearing on the strikes, was widely blamed for having orchestrated the massacre. Interesting. So that might be the real reason why Ivy Lee, a famous public relations man, probably learned everything he knew from Edward Bernays and that sort of crowd, managing the public perception, making sure people still, it's about getting ahead of it, isn't it? And putting out these kind of images of John D. Rockefeller giving money to poor people and handing out coins. And yeah. So the footnote was on page 18. Maybe we'll go back to the bookcam here quickly and have just a look at that to refresh our memory. So it's down here. The legend, which has long persisted that Ivy Lee, the Public Relations Council, advised Mr. Rockefeller to create the various philanthropies as a method of establishing himself in public esteem, has no basis in fact. Mr. Lee did not. So what he's saying here is Ivy Lee was not hired for the purpose of creating the philanthropies to establish Rockefeller as in the public esteem. Excuse me. But he does say Mr. Lee did not become associated with the Rockefeller interest until 1914. So that's an interesting timing that Ivy Lee was hired the same year that this Ludlow massacre took place. So we got approximately 21 people, including wives and children, were killed. So pretty gruesome stuff. And certainly suggests that there's more to the story than we are getting from Fosdick in this book. But anyway, some interesting things to explore and think about. I think we can all agree that this is going to be more of a puff piece, more of a celebration of the man and all the things that he gave to us. But we've got to be critical, and we've got to read with a discerning eye and kind of be cognizant of the things that are being left out. That's I think is the lesson that we need to take and bear in mind. And yeah, just to remind everybody, this is the gentleman we're talking about. And if you believe that he has a heart full of love for humanity, then yeah, I don't know. He's certainly, his face doesn't show it. I think we can all agree on that much. So we are on chapter 2, and we are going to be learning about the birth of the Rockefeller Foundation. So let's do that. Who originally was responsible for the idea of the Rockefeller Foundation, it is now impossible to determine. Well, that's convenient. It was probably Mr. Gates. In a carefully drafted letter which he wrote Mr. Rockefeller in 1905, he suggested the feasibility of a series of, quote, great corporate philanthropies, end quote, to deal with objectives which he described as the promotion of scientific agriculture, the enrichment of rural life in the United States, the development of the fine arts, and the refinement of taste, the promotion of Christian ethics and Christian civilization throughout the world, the development of intelligent citizenship and civic virtue in America. Gates was always troubled by what he called the destiny of Mr. Rockefeller's vast fortune. Quote, "Is it to be handed on to posterity," he asked, "as other great fortunes have been handed down by their possessors, with scandalous results to their descendants and powerful tendencies to social demoralization?" In his letter to Mr. Rockefeller in 1905, he said, "It seems to me that either you and those who live now must determine what shall be the ultimate use of this vast fortune, or at the close of a few lives now in being it must simply pass into the unknown, like some other great fortunes, with unmeasured and perhaps sinister possibilities," end quote. Gates's letter must have made an impression on Mr. Rockefeller, for late in the following year, his son wrote him, referring to an earlier conversation they had had about the establishment of a large trust to which you, Mr. Rockefeller, would turn over considerable sums of money to be devoted to philanthropy, education, science, and religion, end quote. See, this is the kind of quote that, what's the rest of the context? I don't know. We've got footnotes here. We've got references, but it'd be good to read the context, because that quote there could easily be taken out of context. You know, he could be like, "Do you know, we'll have a better time avoiding tax if a large trust to which you would turn over considerable sums of money." You see what I mean? So picking these quotes out, it can paint the picture that they're very kind-hearted and loving and want to do good with this money. But actually, maybe they were discussing, ways to protect it and grow it and avoid the taxation which you would have to pay on normal sort of corporate endeavors. The younger Rockefeller expressed a concern, quote, whether it would be possible to get together a single group of men who could be expected to have knowledge and interest along so many different lines, end quote. But he was anxious to get the idea started in some form and made a number of suggestions on how it might be done. Mr. Rockefeller was not a man to be hurried into precipitate action. Careful study and long deliberation were for him invariably prerequisite to any move in an unknown field. It was 2 years before the idea was sufficiently matured in his mind to enable him to go forward. And during this period, there were many conferences with his son and Mr. Gates. On the 29th of June 1909, he signed a deed of trust, turning over to 3 trustees, his son, Harold McCormick, his son-in-law, and Mr. Gates, 72,569 shares of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, valued at $50 million. The trust to be known by the name of the Rockefeller Foundation. The purposes of the trust as set forth in the deed were, quote, to promote the well-being and to advance the civilization of the peoples of the United States and its territories and possessions and of foreign lands in the acquisition and dissemination of knowledge, in the prevention and relief of suffering, and in the promotion of any and all of the elements of human progress, end quote. Interesting that he threw foreign lands in there as well. This statement of purpose, which was to have significant consequences in the future, was obviously the work of Mr. Gates. Its broad and inclusive terms were characteristic of his imaginative thinking. Quote, is there not something within us, he asked in 1911, an instinct which is the harbinger of better things, an instinct of humanity which cannot be fenced in by the boundaries of a merely national patriotism, a sympathy which transcends national boundaries and finds complete expression only when it identifies us with all humanity, end quote. So that's the kind of seed of, what would you call it? Globalism, of one world government, all humanity, the human family, trying to break down the differences, get rid of the unique characteristics and cultures, and bring it all together under one umbrella. The deed of trust contained a clause by which Mr. Rockefeller reserved the right to revoke it, and this additional sentence throws light on the plan that was under contemplation. Quote, I direct said trustees, as soon as can advisedly be done, to apply to the Congress of the United States or to the legislature of such state as they shall deem advisable for a suitable corporate charter, end quote. In the bylaws which were drawn up at the same time, this interesting sentence appears, quote, as it is the desire of the donor and also of the trustees that for the present the existence of the foundation shall not be made public, pledges may be made in the name of John D. Rockefeller, end quote. In other words, it was believed that before announcing the creation of the foundation, it would be advisable to secure a charter. In the meantime, the 3 trustees of the foundation began to make appropriations of considerable sums, the recipients for the most part representing the special interests in religious and charitable work which Mr. Rockefeller over many years had supported. The adventurous projects which Mr. Gates had in mind, and to which Mr. Rockefeller was entirely hospitable, were postponed until the foundation came officially into being. In March 1910, a bill was introduced in the United States Senate to incorporate the Rockefeller Foundation. It provided that the corporation should report annually to the Secretary of the Interior on the details of its operations, and it contained this clause, quote, this charter shall be subject to alteration, amendment, or repeal at the pleasure of the Congress of the United States. Word for word, it was practically identical with the charter of the General Education Board, which had been granted by an act of Congress 7 years before, and no difficulty was anticipated. There were distinguished precedents for this kind of procedure. Between 1889 and 1907, 34 organizations had secured incorporation by the United States, including the Carnegie Institution of Washington, the American Academy in Rome, and the American Historical Association. To Mr. Rockefeller's advisors, therefore, it seemed appropriate to follow the same course. As a matter of fact, for the general purposes which Mr. Rockefeller had in mind, he need not have gone to Congress at all, or even to a legislature. As a private citizen, he had the right to direct the use of his funds as he saw fit, and a simple deed of trust would have created a foundation such as he contemplated. But Mr. Rockefeller was not trying to escape government control. On the contrary, he seemed to be seeking it. His lawyer, Star J. Murphy, asserted at the hearing before the Senate committee that, quote, "The donor is perfectly content to leave this great foundation in the hands of Congress, that it may at any time in the future exercise its protecting power, not merely to protect his wishes, which are solely that this fund shall always be used for the public welfare and for no other purpose, but also that Congress may have the power, if at any time in the future this fund should get into the hands of men who might seek to use it for improper purposes, to exert its authority and bring this fund back again to the use for which it was intended." That is an interesting clause, actually, that if the fund is taken over by bad actors, Congress has the power to step in and seize control of it again. Very, very interesting. But it shows you the close relationship between Rockefellers and the charitable philanthropic foundations and government, right? In words which represented Mr. Rockefeller's often expressed point of view, Mr. Murphy went on to say, quote, "The charities of the 14th century are not the charities of the 20th century. The charities of the 20th century will not be the charities of the 21st century, and it is eminently desirable that the dead hand should be removed from charitable bequests, and that the power to determine to what specific objects they should be applied should be left in the hands of living men who can judge of the necessities and of the needs in the light of the knowledge which they have as contemporaries, and not that they shall find their hands tied by the will of the man who is long years dead. The wisdom of living men will always exceed the wisdom of any man, however wise, who has been long since dead." End quote. I don't know about that quote. The wisdom of living men will always exceed the wisdom of any man who's dead. Well, I mean, the dead men, right, they had a lot of wisdom, and if they wrote them down in books, then you could probably argue the opposite case there. Just because you're alive today doesn't mean you're wiser than, Plato, Shakespeare, Seneca, any of these powerhouses of creativity and philosophy and art and logic, Another representative of Mr. Rockefeller, Jerome D. Green, who also participated in the attempt to secure a federal charter, expressed in these words the purpose behind the request. Quote, "The motive actuating the incorporation of the Rockefeller Foundation and expressed in its charter is the desire to make this munificent gift directly to the whole American people and forever subject to the control of their elected representatives. This provision not only possesses a sentimental advantage which the charter of a single state would not afford, but it expresses an implicit confidence in the stability of our national life and in the will of the people to deal justly, now and forever, with the high purposes of the proposed foundation." We've got a couple of quotes coming through. Peter's saying, "Behind all great wealth there exists great crimes." That's probably a good rule of thumb. And he's also saying, "But charters have an umbrella effect on coverage, as it is still a very specific legal tool." Yeah, that's it. This is all about the corporate legal structures and legal entities and setting them up and applying that kind of maritime law that we live under to create these corporations, these dead entities, these dead voices, the corpse oration being a dead voice and a dead entity. So it's dressed up and sold to us as in service of the living, but actually it's not at all. And I think even though, like it said back here, being used for public welfare and to to benefit everybody, it's like, again, look at the fruits. What has happened since this was set up? Are people's lives better? Are people's education and health better than they were back then? Do we enjoy more freedom? Do we enjoy more prosperity? I say we, I mean more so in America. I'm not in America, but it's kind of hard to believe. And I mean, at the time, it probably sounded good. I bet a lot of people would really buy into this and believe it and think it was a fantastic thing. But again, words are one thing, but actions and effects in the real world are a very different thing, aren't they? And Peter is saying, they are just like the Caesars of old. They too wish to be immortalized and deified. Yeah. Heidi says, I know where wisdom is, and it's not with living men. And true wisdom is a rare commodity, says Gwen. Yeah, it is. And we're like the modern men and women, we're very kind of brutalized and by the systems that we're born into, and the systems of brainwashing and propagandizing and education and the assault on our physical, biological well-being through chemicals and poor nutrition and whatever the electronic systems and Wi-Fi's and all that kind of stuff around us is doing to us. It's just assaults at every single level that I think as a species, we're probably nowhere near operating at the capacity we could be. And so it's kind of incumbent on each of us as individuals to really focus on being the best that we can be and fulfilling our own potential and trying to do something with our potential. Because we all, despite all this crazy nonsense and attack upon humanity, we still all individually possess amazing potential to do wonderful things. And so, but I think that's, they don't want you to know that. They want you to just sit at home and watch Love Island and Big Brother, Celebrity Big Brother, which is on at 9 p.m. tonight, I believe. I saw an advert for it earlier when I was visiting my dad's house. Okay, let's carry on with this. Part 2. But Congress would have none of it. A storm of protest arose which kept the proposal dangling in the legislature for more than 3 years. After passing the committee stage, the Senate Bill of 1910 was withdrawn, and an amended bill was half-heartedly presented in 1911. A House bill, introduced in 1912, was passed in 1913. But because of delaying tactics, it failed to reach the calendar of the Senate before adjournment. At various stages in the debate, 5 principal amendments to the Charter were adopted, all of which were accepted by Mr. Rockefeller's representatives. 1. That the total property of the corporation should be limited to $100 million. 2. That the income of the corporation was not to be accumulated or added to the principal, but was to be currently applied to the purposes for which the corporation was created. 3. That after the expiration of 50 years, the corporation might distribute the principal as well as the income, and that after 100 years, such distribution was mandatory if Congress so directed. 4. That the election of new trustees should be subject to disapproval within 60 days by a majority of the following persons: the President of the United States, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and the presidents of the following universities: Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and Chicago. 5. That not more than 1/10 of the maximum value of property held under the terms of the Charter could be invested in the securities of any one corporation. Interesting. So it's so tightly knit and bound up in the kind of farcical system of democracy, isn't it? You can see here that while it's saying it's to benefit people, actually what it looks like it's doing, it's being left under the control and reinforcing the very systems of control and top-down slavery, to call it what it is. So very much in bed with the people who are running humanity over the cliff as fast as possible. During the 3-year period that this bill was before Congress, it was the center of violent public controversy, and Mr. Rockefeller was maligned as he seldom had been, even in his earlier years. The papers rang with such phrases as the kiss of Judas Iscariot, the Trojan horse, and tainted money, and some of the speeches in Congress reflected the bitterness and distrust. But it was not alone in the Congress that opposition centered. What Mr. Rockefeller and his associates did not appreciate at the time was that Mr. Taft's administration looked upon the proposal with strong disfavor. In letters which have since been published, it appears that George W. Wickersham, the Attorney General, wrote to President Taft denouncing the proposal. "Never," he declared, "has there been submitted to Congress or to any legislative body such an indefinite scheme for perpetuating vast wealth as this. And personally, I believe it to be entirely inconsistent with the public interest that any such bill should be passed." End quote. To this, Mr. Taft replied, quote, "I agree with your characterization of the proposed act to incorporate John D. Rockefeller," end quote. So it sounds like people, contemporary, saw it for what it was and were calling it out. And it's just amazing to me that Fosdick paints this image of how mistrusted and maligned, and like we're supposed to feel sorry for John D. Rockefeller because everyone just keeps picking on him, even though all he's trying to do is help everybody, and everyone keeps picking on him. Poor John. All right, let's continue. It must be admitted that Mr. Rockefeller's advisors could scarcely have chosen a less auspicious time to attempt to secure a congressional charter for such a project. Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis' $29 million fine imposed upon the Standard Oil Company of Indiana was still fresh in public memory, and the scandal of the letters from Archbold of the Standard Oil Company to Senator Foraker and Mark Hanna had by no means been forgotten. So I don't know anything about any of these incidents, but it sounds like there's a lot of there's a bad taste in the public's mouth about this corporation and this family already. And obviously some corporate, I don't know what the word would be, misdemeanors, if they're handing out a $29 million fine to the Standard Oil Company. That's a hell of a fine, even in today's money, but back then, for sure, big fine. So what was that for? I'm not sure. On top of this, the government's suit for the dissolution of the Standard Oil Company had just been won in the Federal Circuit Court, and the company's lawyers filed their appeal to the United States Supreme Court 5 days after the bill to create the Rockefeller Foundation had been introduced to the Senate. Wow, I didn't know there was a suit for the dissolution of Standard Oil Company. So I suppose it was too big, it was too much of a monopoly, and they wanted to break it up and let other people, have a free market, in other words. That reminds me of Nigel Watson's recent video on economics, and he's trying to explain that we don't have a free market. If you did, things would be much different. Prices would be lower, products and services would be better quality, and entrepreneurs would be able to start businesses. We don't really have that anymore. So it sounds like this is kind of the unmaking of that free market way of producing prosperity and well-being and wealth for the most amount of people. The decision of the Supreme Court upholding the government and ordering the dissolution of the company was handed down while the question of the charter was being debated in Congress. It was this unhappy but uncalculated coincidence which led Mr. Wickersham in his letter to President Taft to ask, quote, "Is it then appropriate that, at the moment when the United States, through its courts, is seeking in a measure to destroy the great combination of wealth which has been built up by Mr. Rockefeller, the Congress of the United States should assist in the enactment of a law to create and perpetuate in his name an institution to hold and administer a large portion of this vast wealth." End quote. Public comment, however, was by no means wholly unfavorable to the proposal. Quote, "To refuse legal sanction to such an undertaking would be a national blunder," said the survey. And I'd love to know who owned that particular publication. Quote, "The greater our confidence in the intelligence and in the capacity of the democracy, the more heartily will we welcome such voluntary socializing of wealth." Socializing of wealth. That's a bit of a clue there, isn't it, as well? End quote. Said the Independent, quote, "We would have such a noble fund allowed to do all the good it can without suspicious limitations," end quote. Quote, "Generations yet undreamed of will profit by the work of this foundation," said the Washington Times, "and no man is possessed of vision so clear as even to glimpse the possibilities of its service," end quote. The Philadelphia Inquirer made this argument, quote, "Much of the criticism is simply because of Rockefeller's success, and much more of it is through an attempt to apply modern business ethics to a time when they did not exist or were not recognized. In any event, the public ought to welcome whatever good the money can produce," end quote. Many papers followed the line of the Chicago Inter-Ocean in its comment that there were statesmen, quote, "who only waited for Rockefeller to come out in favor of the Ten Commandments to ask that they be recorded as against the whole iniquitous proceeding," end quote. So notice that Fosdick here says public comment was not wholly unfavorable, and then he gives us all these quotes, in support of and saying how it's good. But are these public comments, or are these comments from bought and paid for journalists and newspapers? Anyway, we've got a quote from an editorial down here. The editorial continued, quote, "It is safe to say that if Mr. Rockefeller should presume at the present time to ask Congress to sanction in some way his retirement to a monastery, or a trip to the Holy Land, or a gift of several millions to the famine sufferers in China, he would only be wasting his breath. At the mere suggestion of such an unheard of and outrageous proceeding, the patriots would rise with one voice and demand that the insidious, undemocratic, and dangerous proposal be thrown into the wastebasket, and that Mr. Rockefeller be duly warned that such attempts to subvert the very foundations of Republican government would never deceive the statesmen of America." In such an atmosphere of controversy, hopes of federal incorporation withered away. Quote, "To defeat the present bill will not prevent the establishment of the foundation," said Mr. Green in a final plea in Washington. "It will merely prevent Congress from exercising any control over it," end quote. Well, that's a bold claim right there. It's like either we do it with you or we do it without you, but either way we're doing it. That tells you a lot more about who's in control and who's in charge and who really has clout. If he's saying, well, you can get on board and sign off on this and be part of it, or we'll leave you and go and do it anyway. But the door was closed, and Mr. Rockefeller's advisors turned to the New York State Legislature. Within 2 months after adjournment of Congress in 1913, an act was passed in Albany incorporating the Rockefeller Foundation. The news of the event created scarcely a ripple in the press. Indeed, it passed almost without notice. And probably because the press were told not to report it or mention it or publish it in their papers. Maybe that could be why. The amendments to the charter, which Congress had added during the course of the debate and to which Mr. Rockefeller's associates had somewhat reluctantly acquiesced, were omitted in the legislative act, and somewhere along the line the statement of the purpose of the foundation, which in the congressional bill had followed the language of Mr. Rockefeller's deed of trust, had been happily shortened to a single phrase: "to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world." This phrase was to be the guiding star of the organization. The words of Mr. Gates were destined to set the aim of the foundation in terms of human welfare in a world without boundary lines. Pretty revealing, actually, that bit there. So, to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world, has that happened? Has that happened since 1913 when the Rockefeller Foundation was incorporated? But are we heading into a world without boundary lines? I think there's a good case to say we are. I think boundaries and borders are more porous right now than they have been in the past. And not only are they more porous, but those traveling in certain directions tend to get rewarded and supported and looked after and taken care of at the natives' expense. So kind of telling us the truth while also kind of lying as well. But they do tend to tell you what they're doing, don't they? I'll just have a quick look through the comments here. Maritime law and commerce, with the emphasis on commerce, says Peter. Yeah, this is the whole thing, isn't it? This is the whole system that we're in. It's this whole contractual maritime law, and men and women who are lost at sea are assumed dead, and then this Crow 777 does a good series of videos and podcasts, about this legal system that we have, and there's a big difference between legal and lawful, and the legal system is pertaining to dead entities, and that's corporations, and that's why they're treated as they're given this personhood status. It's all very complicated, but it's all in the words, and you've got to know exactly how the words are being used, and it's a different language altogether, legalese. Peter says, orators of death equals corporations. Yeah, well said. Oh, I like that. That's good. I'm stealing that. Heidi says, at every level, a different devil. And that's another good one. I like that too. We should put all these into a song. These are good song lyrics and titles and stuff. LJ says, it's a big club and we're not in it. George Carlin. What a guy. Cool. Let's carry on. Part 3. The Rockefeller Foundation was launched in an atmosphere unhappily streaked by misgiving and distrust. With his characteristic directness and perhaps a trace of his training as a preacher, Gates said to Mr. Rockefeller, quote, if any man's happiness in doing good depends on human gratitude or praise, if his satisfaction is sought from any source except the silent approval of conscience, that man's sun will go down at the end amid the clouds of a disappointed and embittered life. So he's saying, as long as your conscience, so this is very solipsist, and this is very this is moral relativism at its best, and this is surprising coming from a guy who's supposed to be a Christian, but he's basically saying you decide what is good, you listen to your conscience, and even if everybody around you is telling you they don't want it and it's a bad thing and it's a terrible thing and it's having negative effects, as long as you and your conscience are happy with it, then it's the good and right thing to do. So that is very revealing about the philosophy of these kind of people, which is moral relativism. The ends justify the means. Might makes right. So no wonder Rockefeller's up to no good with somebody like Frederick T. Gates whispering in his ear. And we were talking in our Telegram group as well about how this Frederick T. Gates, his relationship to Rockefeller seems to be that similar to the relationship between Colonel House and President Wilson, which we learned a little bit about back in the Lusitania reading. And we're kind of, that's a kind of idea that we were playing around with at the minute, but I think it's kind of fitting. You've got Frederick T. Gates whispering into his ear here that, like, it doesn't matter. Just listen to your own conscience and you decide what the right thing to do is. Mr. Rockefeller's reply, according to Gates, quote, uttered with deliberation and unwanted emphasis, was, don't I know that? So Rockefeller's already a moral relativist at this time. Gates is just, he's preaching to the choir. But Mr. Rockefeller was not easily discouraged, and he was not moved by misrepresentation or calumny. For fear that its disclosure might jeopardize the chances of obtaining a federal charter, he had revoked in November 1910 the deed of gift of $50 million, which he had made a year and a half before. But in January 1913, when the prospect of congressional incorporation was momentarily bright, he had turned over to 4 trustees bonds in the value of $3.2 million to be conveyed, quote, or as much thereof as shall remain in the hands of the trustees, end quote, to the Rockefeller Foundation, whenever it was created. As soon as the charter had been received from the New York State Legislature, he made a gift to the foundation of approximately $35 million, and the following year another gift of $65 million. His total gifts, and I think we should replace the word gifts with deposits. His total gifts to the foundation are listed below, and there's a lot of numbers there. I'll zoom in just in case you want a closer look. There you go. That's a lot of dollar. Totaling $182 million. And then in 1912, received from the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial a further 58.7. So grand total, $241.5 million. Look at all those gifts. The letter which accompanied these various gifts always followed the same pattern. Quote, it is more convenient for me to provide funds for the foundation by a gift of these specific securities than by a gift of cash. And I believe the securities have intrinsic and permanent value which would justify you in retaining them as investments. But in order to relieve you from any uncertainty or embarrassment with regard to them, I desire to state specifically that you are under no obligation to retain any of these investments, but are at liberty to dispose of them or any of them and change the form of investment whenever in your judgment it seems wise, end quote. Yeah, so I'm not so well-versed in the realm of finance and financial instruments, but securities This word here, securities. I've done a little bit of reading of listening to Parallel Mike's podcast here on YouTube. He puts out some really good stuff. He actually explains finances in a way I understand. And he was interviewing David Webb, who wrote The Great Taking. And that book is basically explaining how all of these paper bonds and securities and assets that are man-made, there's a legal mechanism in place to scoop all of that up and hand off all the collateral to a certain class of secured creditors. So that's The Great Taking by David Rogers Webb. And so to me, I see the word securities and I just kind of interpret it as some sort of scam. But I'm not so literate in these matters to be able to explain it properly and teach others about it. But they're called securities. In Upside Down, Inside Out, Back to Front World, we should probably read the exact opposite of that. Or maybe they're just secure for a certain class of person, the insured creditors, but not for people like you and me. In his early gifts, Mr. Rockefeller reserved the right to make designations annually, up to $2 million of the income, to such organizations and projects within the corporate purposes of the foundation as he might see fit to choose. But the arrangement proved awkward, and Mr. Rockefeller relinquished his right in 1917. The first trustees of the foundation, named in the Act of Incorporation in addition to Mr. Rockefeller, were John D. Rockefeller Jr., Mr. Gates, Harry Pratt Judson, president of the University of Chicago, Dr. Simon Flexner, Star J. Murphy, Jerome D. Green, Dr. Wycliffe Rose, and Charles O. Haight. Within a few months, President Eliot of Harvard was added to the board, and A. Barton Hepburn, president of the Chase National Bank. The trustees held their first meeting in May 1913. Mr. Rockefeller Jr. was elected president, and in 1917 became chairman. Excuse me a sec. Bit of an itchy throat. Rockefeller Jr. became president. That's where we were at, wasn't it? And in 1917 became chairman of the board. Mr. Green was made secretary and the administrative responsibility was placed in his hands. There was a brief time in my little room at 26 Broadway, wrote Green years later, when one secretary and one 4-drawer file constituted the staff and equipment of the Rockefeller Foundation. Green was 39 years old at the time. A Harvard graduate, he had served as secretary to President Eliot and as secretary to the Corporation of Harvard University. In 1911, he had been appointed general manager of the Rockefeller Institute, where his work attracted the attention of Mr. Rockefeller Jr. Alert, poised, with a quick, imaginative mind and a creative drive, Green brought rare talent to his new task, and his influence in shaping the early years of the foundation was impressive. The question which faced the trustees as they sat down to their first meeting was how the broad objective of their charter was to be implemented. What constitutes the well-being of mankind throughout the world? Yeah, I'm sure the answer is going to be something like, I don't know, one world government or, injections for everybody. A large number of applications had already been received, and it is, or I don't know, corporate socialism. A large number of applications had already been received, and it's significant that they were all declined, including one from the YMCA for the rehabilitation of buildings located in Dayton, Hamilton, and Marietta, which had been damaged in the recent floods along the Ohio River Valley. Mr. Gates phrased the objection, quote, "The Rockefeller Foundation should in general confine itself to projects of an important character, too large to be undertaken, or otherwise unlikely to be undertaken by other agencies," end quote. This was in line with the emphasis which Mr. Rockefeller himself 6 years earlier had placed on what he called finalities. Quote, "The best philanthropy," he said, "involves a search for cause, an attempt to cure evils at their source," end quote. So he should really be going to, the Federal Reserve in this case, or the Bank of England maybe. It was in line with this type of thinking that Green, a few months later, but this kind of reminds me of, remember when Google was first founded and they had the tagline, "Do no evil," or "Don't be evil," or something like that, and they soon got rid of it. Kind of reminds me of that. It was in line with this type of thinking that Green, a few months later, presented to the trustees, quote, a memorandum on principles and policies, which was to have a significant influence on the development of the foundation, based in large part on the experience of Mr. Rockefeller and Mr. Gates in the long years of their association, and reflecting the current practices of the General Education Board and the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, it established a rough framework within which the foundation operated, with relatively few deviations during subsequent years. Green's memorandum covered the following points. 1. Individual charity and relief are excluded. 2. Institutions or enterprises that are purely local are similarly excluded. Globalism. Except as aid may be given to their establishment as models to other localities. 3. When an institution goes into a community with the intention of making a contribution to its welfare, no gift of money, however large, and no outside agency, however wise or good, can render a service of permanent value except insofar as the gift or the agency offers the means or the occasion for evoking from the community its own recognition of the need to be met, its own will to meet that need, and its own resources, both material and spiritual, wherewith to meet it. 4. In general, it is unwise for an institution like the Rockefeller Foundation to assume permanently or indefinitely a share of the current expenses of an institution which it does not control. Such a continuing relation inevitably carries with it a continuing responsibility for the conduct of the institution that is aided, and the implied continuing approval of management tends to make the receiver subservient to the giver, thus detracting from the receiver's independence and self-respect. When giving to the support of institutions or movements for which the community, whether general or local, ought to make itself responsible, the foundation will, as a rule, assume less than half of the cost of current expenditure. The foundation must carefully avoid the dangers incident to gifts in perpetuity. It should not hamper the trustees of other institutions by gifts in perpetuity narrowly limited to particular uses. 6. As between objects which are of an immediately remedial or alleviatory nature, such as asylums for the orphans, blind or cripples, and those which go to the root of individual or social ill-being and misery, the latter objects are preferred. Not that the former are unworthy, but because the latter are more far-reaching in their effects. So we don't want to help the orphans, the blinds, and the cripples. We'll go to the root of the problem, which sounds kind of like eugenics, Sounds like they're going to say we need to prevent people giving birth to people who will end up blind, orphans, or cripples in the first place, doesn't it? That's what it sounds. That's me reading between the lines right there. 4. Self-imposed limitations do not constitute a program, and while a framework may be essential, it is necessarily negative rather than positive. What were the pregnant ideas, to use Gates's term, to whose birth assistance could be given? From the very first meeting, it seemed to the trustees of the foundation that public health ranked well toward the top. Quote, if science and education are the brain and nervous system of civilization, said Mr. Gates, health is its heart. It is the organ that pushes the vital fluid into every part of the social organism, enabling each organ to function, and measuring and limiting its effective life. Disease is the supreme ill of human life, and it is the main source of almost all other human ills: poverty, crime, ignorance, vice, inefficiency, hereditary taint, and many other evils. The enthusiasm with which the trustees supported the opinion of Mr. Gates was due in large part to the dramatic success which the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission was achieving under the leadership of Dr. Rose in eliminating hookworm in the southern states. At their first meeting, therefore, the trustees of the foundation recorded their opinion that the extension of hookworm work to other parts of the world would be one of the most productive lines of activity to be undertaken, and Dr. Rose was asked to prepare a plan of operation. A month later, the International Health Board, and a little footnote, the International Health Board was first called the International Health Commission, then it was christened the International Health Board, and finally, in 1927, the International Health Division. A month later, the International Health Board of the Rockefeller Foundation was established with Dr. Rose as director, quote, to extend to other countries and peoples the work of eradicating hookworm disease as an opportunity offers, and so far as practicable, to follow up the treatment and cure of this disease with the establishment of agencies for the promotion of public sanitation and the spread of the knowledge of scientific medicine." End quote. The old Sanitary Commission was merged with this new organization, which was launched on a career of such wide-reaching significance that even the do it for some reason. I'll upload the second half of this. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. Hang on. Oh, we're back. I just had to type something in the chat. Weird. I don't know what happened there. I completely lost my place. Let's go for this quote. Oh, yeah, we're reading about China, aren't we? With the incorporation of the foundation, an accomplished fact, Gates moved to the attack, warmly supported by Dr. Eliot of Harvard, who had recently returned from an extended trip to China. A conference was called in New York early in 1914, which was attended not only by the representatives of the foundation and the General Education Board, but by the executive officers of the principal missionary boards employing medical missionaries. Mr. Rockefeller Jr., who presided, set the matter before the meeting in these interesting terms. Quote, "The Rockefeller Foundation, which I presume is the host on this occasion, is a very small child, very young and inexperienced. It has the world as its field, and it has very few plans. It is planning to go very slowly in laying out its work. And our thought has been to get all the information we can with reference to the different eligible fields, so that when we do arrive at some conclusion as to a point of attack, we feel that we know all that can be known about the problem involved and that we are acting under the best advice obtainable. We are not committing ourselves to anything in China. We simply state that there is a great opportunity, a great need. Now let us study the situation and see whether there develops upon this foundation a responsibility in this particular country." The results of the discussion were considered at a later meeting of the trustees of the foundation with the following conclusions. 1. That any work in China should be in medicine, probably because they had a really robust and functioning and effective medical paradigm, the Chinese medicine. So whatever work we need to do over here, we need to hijack their medicine. And 2, that whatever might be undertaken should be based on existing agencies, whether missionary or governmental. So they're willing to work with the Chinese government at the time. A week later, Mr. Gates presented to the trustees a plan for the gradual and orderly development of a comprehensive system of medicine in China, a document of such high strategic importance that it served as a guide for the activities of the foundation in this area for many years. Out of it came the Judson Commission to China, the creation of the China Medical Board, and the building of the Peking Union Medical College, which over the years was the outpost of modern medicine in the Far East, the symbol and synonym for high quality in professional education in China. So that's we're at part 5 now. Everything's still all right on the stream? Yeah, I think we're good. 5. In spite of this auspicious beginning, the details of it are considered in later chapters. Stormy days lay ahead for the foundation. As Mr. Rockefeller Jr. had said at the China conference, the foundation was a very small child, very young and inexperienced. It was groping its way toward a program, with no precedents to guide so large an undertaking, and without the accumulated wisdom of trial and error in the management of a vast charitable trust. In a sense, it was misled by its own early success. The International Health Board and the China Medical Board seemed to furnish a desirable pattern of action. These groups were direct agencies of the foundation, financed and operated by the foundation, and it was natural to assume that similar boards or divisions could in this manner effectively handle other perplexing and frequently controversial problems. Thus, in the field of mental hygiene, Dr. Thomas Salmon, one of the country's leading psychiatrists, was added to the staff of the foundation. And it was apparently the intention of the trustees that the studies and surveys for which he was to be responsible were to be carried on by the foundation through its own personnel, and that, quote, the related fields of heredity alcoholism, and venereal diseases were to be included. Similarly, in 1914, the trustees seriously considered the desirability of establishing, under the auspices of the Foundation, an organization for the study of social and economic questions, and a committee of economists under the chairmanship of Professor Edwin F. Gay of Harvard recommended that the subject of prices be the first study undertaken. Difficulty immediately arose. However, when the trustees decided to use the personnel and machinery of the Foundation in a direct approach to the problem of industrial relations, Mr. W. L. Mackenzie King of Canada, who had made a distinguished record in this field, was appointed director of the project. Unfortunately, this action was taken against the background of one of the most savage strikes in history. In the history of American industry, a strike of mine workers involving, among other companies, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, in which the Rockefellers were financially interested. The strike culminated in the tragic Ludlow massacre, where, in a pitched battle between the strikers and the state militia, many were killed and injured. Federal troops finally brought the situation under control. Now, that's a coincidence. I didn't know that the Ludlow massacre was going to be mentioned in this part of the book, so quite an interesting synchronicity there. And it looks like that's the only mention it's going to get as well. Although the action of the Foundation in retaining Mr. King was inspired by completely sincere motives and by a deep desire to find a practicable solution to a thorny problem, a large section of the public was unconvinced. And once more, the papers rang with abuse and vituperation. There's a new word. Vituperation. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The United States Commission on Industrial Relations, a federal group headed by Senator Frank P. Walsh, began an investigation of the Foundation, and public hearings were held in which Mr. Rockefeller and most of the trustees were subpoenaed as witnesses. Oh no, it is still talking about this Ludlow massacre then. The insistent question was whether there was a dividing line between Mr. Rockefeller's interests and the interests of the Rockefeller Foundation. For weeks, the investigation was headline news, and apprehensions about the potential dangers from the abuse of the Foundation's power were spread across the country. In the end, more sober counsel seemed to prevail. Dr. George Kirchway, Dean of the Columbia Law School, testifying before the Commission on the Charter Powers of the Federation, said that inasmuch as the concentration of enormous wealth in the hands of any individual was productive of a certain amount of discontent, he considered the situation, quote, distinctly bettered by the transfer of that wealth from an individual to a corporation, which is legally, to a certain degree at least, responsible to the public, end quote. I should not think, he added, that the possession of great wealth by the Rockefeller Foundation would be as apt to cause irritation and discontent and unrest as the possession and conspicuous use of the same wealth by Mr. Rockefeller himself. So I kind of feeling here that this money has been dumped into this foundation so that they can do things with it that were a man or woman to do those things. They could be sued or held accountable or be brought to justice or be arrested or put in prison or whatever. But since it's a corporation and you can't arrest a corporation and you can't make a corporation stand trial, it kind of is. It's like a buffer between rolling out this money, advancing the agendas in the name of the greater good, but it's providing a buffer so that the people who want to roll out these plans are not able to be held accountable. Mr. Rockefeller, in his testimony before the commission, answered the charge as to the possible abuse of power by the Foundation in these words, quote, I have such confidence in democracy that I believe it can better be left to the people and their representatives to remedy the evils when there is some tangible reason for believing they are impending, rather than to restrict the power for service in anticipation of purely hypothetical dangers. And there lay the principal answer to the investigation. The United States Commission remained skeptical of the new organization that bore the Rockefeller name. The mellowing process of time, the perspective of events, the tangible proof that integrity as well as high purpose lay behind the creation of the Foundation, these developments were necessary before public judgment could be adequately informed. To the Foundation, the impact of this investigation was deeply discouraging, but in the long run, it proved to be salutary. Among the lessons that were learned in a hard way, was one that was related to the central question which the trustees have earnestly been asking themselves from the beginning. What can a private foundation endowed with large resources wisely do, and what are the appropriate methods and techniques to be used? The answer to the latter part of the question was now obvious, certainly as far as the Rockefeller Foundation was concerned. Except for a narrower range of non-controversial subjects, notably public health, medicine, and agriculture, the Foundation's participation in the areas it wished to assist must be limited to grants to outside agencies competently organized and staffed to carry on the work in question. In other words, the Foundation must become primarily not an operating agency, but a fund dispensing agency. This new policy obviously did not imply that the Foundation would avoid controversial questions. It meant that its approach to such questions would take the form of grants to agencies independent of Foundation control. In no other way could the objectivity of research be established beyond cavil, and the projects freed from suspicion of ulterior interest. This was the new pattern which the Foundation was to follow for many years to come. And I'm just going to take a quick sip. So it seems like we're back on track and the stream's working okay. Yeah, so that's kind of the sense I'm getting now, is that this was a way to dole out money to projects and people and organizations that were furthering the agenda of the Rockefellers in a way that the Rockefellers themselves couldn't be held accountable or responsible. That's what it seems to me. What do you think? Part 6. While the trustees in the early years were exploring questions of policy and program, gifts were being made to a wide variety of institutions and causes. In retrospect, there seems to have been little cohesion in these first appropriations. They apparently followed the interests and needs of the moment rather than any definite design. A bird refuge in Louisiana was purchased and presented to the state. Substantial grants were made to the Rockefeller Institute, to the Palisades Interstate Park, to Wellesley College, the American Academy in Rome, the Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor, the Bureau of Municipal... That's a great one, isn't it? The Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor. So instead of just giving your money directly to the poor people and helping them in that way, it's give your money to an association of people who are working on this problem of improving the condition to the poor. just bonkers. The Bureau of Municipal Research and the Institute for Government Research. It must be remembered that the early days of the Foundation coincided with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Now then, that is curious, isn't it? So I wonder if there was some motive or method or means by which this money was now protected, more so than if it had been still in the Standard Oil Company or in Rockefeller's bank account or whatever. I wonder if shifting it over into this Rockefeller Foundation Corporation meant that money was now untouchable if war broke out. Because Rockefeller was probably the kind of guy who was connected and would have probably received word very early on, forewarning that a war was coming. I wonder if this was a move that enabled him to protect that wealth and keep it out of the war. I don't know. From the very beginning, the Foundation played a significant part in war relief activities, and when the sum was totaled up at the end, it had spent more than $22 million for this purpose. With Belgium facing a famine as a result of the German invasion, the Foundation itself chartered ships and dispatched them across the ocean, loaded with food. It sent commissions of inquiry to many European nations and followed up its inquiries with supplies for countries like Poland, Serbia, Armenia, Syria, Montenegro, and Albania. It appropriated hundreds of thousands of dollars to organizations like the American Red Cross, curious, the Commission on Training Camp Activities, and the societies that were contributing to the morale of the troops. It interested itself in the welfare of prisoners of war and in the various demonstration hospital units. It was a long, exhausting, and frequently frustrating task, and for nearly 5 years it overshadowed in priority and apparent importance all other activities which the Foundation undertook. Dr. George E. Vincent, who assumed the presidency of the Foundation in 1917, said later on, as he looked back on this feverish period, quote, "I suppose we had to do it, and I suppose it was worthwhile. But think of the creative job we could have done with that money in a world of reason and sanity." Over the next 3 decades, this despondent note was to be sounded more than once by trustees and officers alike as war and its aftermath slashed through the plans and projects of the Foundation. With the advent of Vincent and the close of the First World War, a more promising era seemed to be opening up. Vincent himself, who came from the presidency of the University of Minnesota, was a different kind of person from any who had previously been associated with the organization. Urbane, brilliantly witty, skeptical of Gates's absolutes and finalities, he cared passionately for fairness, tolerance, and justice. Quote, "Eagles in captivity look resentful and remote," said Dr. Alan Gregg in describing him. "But if you can imagine a genial and alert eagle, attentive, spirited, and eager, you would have my first and lasting impression of President Vincent." End quote. One of the great public speakers of his generation, and certainly one of the wittiest, Vincent perhaps did more than any other single man to explain and interpret to America the interests and purposes of the Rockefeller Foundation. He was deeply sincere, and he abhorred pretense. He loved excellence and hated everything that was shoddy and second-rate. He was constantly alert to the tendency of power to be ostentatious and of wealth to think of itself in terms of exaggerated importance. With his deep concern for rectitude and teamwork and the free exchange of ideas, he built up an esprit de corps in the Foundation, the memory of which still survives. Under such leadership, it was inevitable that the program should take on a different emphasis, and change was already in the air. Gates was beginning to thunder against what he called the policy of scatteration, and in the final months of the war, the opinion of the trustees was swinging sharply to a more closely integrated program of work. Gates wrote, quote, "If I have any regret, it is that the charter of the Rockefeller Foundation did not confine its work strictly to national and international medicine, health, and its appointments. Insofar as the disbursements of the Rockefeller Incorporated philanthropies have been rigidly confined to these 2 fields of philanthropy, medicine and public health, they have been almost universally commended at home and abroad. Where they have inadvertently transgressed these limits, they have been widely, and in some particulars perhaps not unfairly, condemned." End quote. The temperament of Mr. Gates did not permit him a great deal of leeway in his judgments between black and white, and his exact words would not perhaps have received the endorsement of his contemporaries. But in general, this was the trend of thinking among the trustees as the war came to an end, and for the next 10 years, the major interest of the Foundation was to center in medical education and public health, conceived in global terms, with the whole world as a field of strategy. And that is the end of chapter 2. And the next one is chapter 3, which is all about the control of hookworm. Let's see how... Okay. So that's going to be another 14 pages. So, how did everyone enjoy that chapter? I'm just going to have another sip and lubricate my throat. So the chat is still not working properly for me in the OBS, but I can see it over here on my second monitor. So a lot of messages saying that we got back. Oh, Chi, how's it going? Welcome, sir. Yeah, so LJ says unaccountable. Yeah. So I think that's what it's looking like to me. It's like this was a way to separate that accountability, and then we can be like, well, you know, the corporation did it. It wasn't us. Peter says intentional so they can tuck them away and do what they will. More Roman than Rome. Rosemary Smith is here. Hello, Rosemary. Mr. Gates does sound like someone, also same name. It is interesting. Mr. Gates has no first name. Yeah. So in the first chapter, this guy's Frederick T. Gates, and we had a bit of a conversation in the Telegram group about whether or not he is related to Billy, who we all know has a lot of plans these days and is rolling out lots of, he's buying up a lot of farm. He's very interested in public health as well and medicine, very similarly to the Rockefeller Foundation. So there's conflicting information out there as to whether Frederick T. Gates and Billy are related. But I just said in the last video how strange it is that there's two families, both with the same name, involved in philanthropy and charity and doing good for the world and saving the world's people, and they've got the same name and there's no relation. I find it hard to believe. I do find it hard to believe. Heidi says it's like watching a monster being made. I hope you're not talking about me. LJ says great, really interesting chapters. Yeah, and actually, it seems to me that even though the John D. Rockefeller Sr. left all this money and bequeathed it, I think I don't know if the real harm and the evil intent behind it, was that more of John D. Jr.'s doing? I don't know. My history isn't so good that I know what the times were like. It does mention that they amassed this wealth during a time when business ethics weren't so well defined, which in other ways just means they did it through criminal behavior and immoral behavior. And that's mentioned. That was mentioned in chapter 1 and this chapter. And that's kind of like as much as they say on how this fortune came to exist in the first place. So actually, I probably retract that. I guess they're the senior and the junior are both probably nasty pieces of work. Chi, you came in late, but you will listen to the first part later. No problem. I hope you enjoy it. I wonder if we could crack on and do another one. It's Friday night. Should we do another chapter? Do we all want to learn about the control of hookworm? So hookworm was an interesting one because I don't really know how that manifests as a disease or as a set of symptoms. I don't know what the treatment would be. My sense and my feeling is that there's the whole history of medicine is very much full of misinformation, I think. And I've got a few books on it on the shelf back there. What Really Makes You Ill is one of them. And another one is The Invisible Rainbow. And there's another one, Roman Bistrianic, his book on the the boop boops, the arm things that they like to give out. And in many cases, these interventions that are now celebrated and lauded get rolled out after the symptoms and the diseases are already kind of on the wane and reducing. So I'd be interested actually to learn more about hookworm. What its causes are, what its treatments were before the Rockefellers got involved. So yeah, I say, okay, let's carry on. Let's do a bit more. Heidi says, I think humans are wonderful and it's groups and ideologies that make them monsters. Well said. I would give you a round of applause for that one. I can't share it on the screen or anything for everybody to look at, but that's a really good quote. I agree with you. I do. I think we are wonderful as individuals, and then when we get into groups and then we have to subsume our individual identity to the benefit of the group, to the greater good, that's when problems start to happen. And it's kind of ironic in a way because we need each other. We do need families, communities, we need friends, we need romance, we need elders, and we need to teach young people. It's all part of it. Being human is a social thing. We are social creatures, but it's always when these groups come along and you have to, sacrifice the individual for the greater good and the good of the group and the common good. That's when evil stuff tends to happen, isn't it? That is how it happens. All right, let's crack on. Let's learn about hookworm. Do we need a bit of light on that? Does that look any better? Yeah, that's not too bad, is it? Okay. The Control of Hookworm, Chapter 3. When the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission under Dr. Wycliffe Rose was merged with the Rockefeller Foundation, it had already achieved, in the 5 years of its existence, an impressive record in the control of hookworm in the southern states. Here was a widespread anemia-producing disease which sapped vitality and handicapped, crippled, and even killed millions of men, women, and children in the hot, moist regions of the world. Here was a disease, too, for which an effective remedy had already been discovered, a remedy easily administered and quick in its results. The obstacles were ignorance and lethargy. Ignorance as to the existence and extent of the disease, and lethargy on the part of the medical profession and of the health authorities in taking action even when the facts were surmised. Indeed, when Rose began his work in 1910, knowledge of the disease was confined to a relatively small minority of physicians, few of whom realized its importance as a feature of their practice. Of the laymen who had heard of it, many regarded it as a myth, and yet the disease was rampant in the South. In many of the rural schools, the number of infected children ran as high as 90%, and of the more than 500,000 children examined by Rose's associates in the 5 years from 1910 to 1914, 39% were infected. In one school in Virginia, for example, 38 of the 40 children present were infected, and in addition, there were 45 other children belonging to the school who, because of the severity of the disease, were not strong enough to attend. The incidence was high even among adults. 300 college students were examined as a body without reference to clinical symptoms. 42% had hookworm. 3 regiments of state militia were similarly examined with infection rates of 36%, 58%, and 32% respectively. So this is interesting, right? Because it sounds to me like they are finding all this high percentage of hookworm without reference to clinical symptoms. So it's like, oh, having no symptoms is a symptom, so we better test you to find out if you have the thing. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Rose's first task, therefore, was to demonstrate to the people of the southern states that hookworm disease was a reality. This is like deja vu. So these people they're not aware of the disease. Why not? Maybe because they don't have it and it doesn't exist. Oh, but we need to demonstrate to them that they have a disease. So that was Rose's first task. That it was a serious handicap, and that it was both curable and preventable. Probably the dramatic life story of the hookworm as a human parasite was of considerable assistance in the development of the campaign. For this blood-sucking inhabitant of the intestine does not enter the body by way of the human mouth, but through the sole of the human foot, in the form of minute and almost invisible larvae. Its well-encapsulated form gets into the bloodstream and by way of the lungs and throat finally lands in the stomach, where its coating protects it from gastric juices. It passes from the stomach to the small intestine, which is its future home. From then on, all it has to do is to eat, grow, and copulate. It does not produce its young in the intestine, but it lays eggs, which pass out with the stool and contaminate the soil so that other bare feet can pick up the new larvae which hatch from the eggs. Pretty interesting stuff. I didn't know that. The victims of this invading host become increasingly anemic. Strength is dissipated and growth is stunted. The familiar symptoms are emaciation, protruding shoulder blades, angel wings, a bloated stomach and swollen joints. Ulcers form on the legs and are not easily healed, and the skin becomes sallow. In advanced cases, the appetite is perverted and dirt eating is not uncommon. Wow. And yet the remedy, developed in Italy in the latter part of the 19th century, was surprisingly simple. Capsules of thymol and salts, taken over a period of about 18 hours. Feeding capsules to my hookworms, said a patient in Georgia, was like feeding buckshot to frogs. Once cleared of hookworm, the victims could be protected from reinfection by sanitary latrines and the wearing of shoes. Yeah, so it sounds to me like the sanitation and wearing shoes is actually the critical thing here. The first step of the campaign which Rose undertook was a thorough survey to determine the geographic distribution of the disease and the approximate degree of infection. Rose never would move without first getting the facts. The second stage was a battle of publicity. He had to dramatize to the people of the South the fact that hookworm disease, with its evil train of social and economic consequences, could be brought under control. Dramatize, that's an interesting word to use, isn't it? by lectures, exhibits, and demonstrations. He had to gain the support of newspapers, doctors, health workers, and the general public. He had to show the startling results of the simple treatments in the lives of people. This is, yes, LJ, it does sound familiar, doesn't it? To accomplish this purpose, a director of sanitation was appointed in each of the 11 states where the hookworm was contemplated. Contemplated. Under each director was a corps of sanitary inspectors and a staff of microscopists. The work was centered around traveling dispensaries conducted for the free examination and free treatment of all persons who applied. Extensive literature was circulated and meetings were held. The support of the schools was enlisted, and the educational departments of state and county became the strongest allies in the campaign. To prevent the recurrence of the disease, over 250,000 rural homes were inspected by the sanitary personnel, and major emphasis was placed on soil pollution and the necessity of sanitary privies. Of the 1,142 countries in the 11 states, extensive operations were carried out in 653. Over 25,000 public meetings were held, with a total attendance of more than 2 million people, and the number of pieces of literature distributed was in excess of 3.25 million. This was in accord with the meticulous plans which Rose had laid down at the beginning before the work had even begun. So this is a massive PR campaign. Quote, the public consciousness will be aroused to the necessity of action by the publication of the facts as revealed by the investigation. Such agencies as public health organizations, associated charities, women's clubs, school improvement leagues, ministers, teachers, and practicing physicians will be called into service in the interest of awakened and enlightened public opinion. 5 years later, he was able to say in the final report of the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, quote, the work of demonstrating to the people of these 11 southern states that hookworm disease is a reality and that it can be cured and prevented may be said to have been accomplished, end quote. So they've been successfully propagandized, in other words. All this immense activity represented a cooperative effort between the state and county governments on the one hand and Rose's organization on the other. The governmental units contributed to the expense of a ratio of about 1 to 8, but the personnel provided largely by the board was at all times under state control. This was in accord with Rose's deep-seated philosophy. Quote, the eradication of this disease is a work which no outside agency working independently could do for a people if it would, and one which no agency should do if it could. The economic prosperity of the state, the lives and health of its people, and the education of its children are involved. If the infection is to be stamped out, the states in which it exists must assume the responsibility. An outside agency can be helpful only insofar as it aids the states in organizing and bringing into activity their own forces, end quote. I'm just going to have a sip. This is really good. I'm glad we decided to carry on with this chapter. 2. When the work of the Sanitary Commission became a part of the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913 and was christened with the new name International Health Board, Rose embarked on a bold plan which had intrigued him from the beginning. To what extent he was influenced by Gates's vaulting imagination, it is not now possible to estimate. But as early as 1911, he was beginning to gather information on the extent and range of hookworm in other countries. His inquiries made through government agencies in Washington and abroad brought out the fact that hookworm runs around the earth in a great belt about 66 degrees wide, extending from parallel 36 north to parallel 30 south, and that practically all countries lying within these two parallels, containing about 1,000 million people, are infected. Already, he had personally seen the devastating consequences of the disease in Puerto Rico, and the idea took root in his mind that the same technique which had been so successfully applied in the southern states could be translated to a far broader area. It was undoubtedly this conception which lay behind the wording of the resolution of the Foundation trustees in establishing the International Health Board. To extend to other countries and people the work of eradicating hookworm disease. In preparation for his new undertaking, Rose made 3 trips, one to England, where he conferred with authorities of the Colonial Office, one to the British West Indies, and one to the Far East, where his inquiries took him to Egypt, Ceylon, Malaya, and the Philippines. The West Indies and Central America were also visited by members of Rose's staff, and the strategy was developed for a mass attack on hookworm infection around the world. The war against hookworm. Do your part. In the years that followed, Rose's daring enterprise was extended to 52 countries in 6 continents and to 29 islands of the seas. It followed the hookworm belt all the way from Fiji and Samoa westward, through the Antipodes and the Far East to Africa and the Mediterranean basin, and thence to the West Indies and the Americas. Literally millions of people were examined for the disease in these various regions, and millions were found infected and were treated. Following the practice established in the southern states, the work was always carried on as a cooperative undertaking between the International Health Board and the governments of the countries that were involved. Quote, "A partner, but not a patron," was the slogan. The board furnished the technical leadership and a graduated portion of the cost, but the countries also contributed in varying amounts, and the project was always an integral part of the machinery of government. Demonstrations in which the authorities do not participate to a substantial degree from the inception of the project are not likely to be successful, said Rose. The country must be sufficiently interested to risk something, to follow the plan critically, to take over the cost of the work gradually but steadily, and within a reasonable period to assume the entire burden of direction and expense. Indeed, this principle of working through governments, to use Rose's phrase, was a conception with which he started from the beginning and from which he never varied. It was fundamental to every plan that he made. Unless the work was carried out under the authority and direction of government, and he always used a capital G in writing the word, it had no foundation and no permanence. Yeah, these bloody statists. This conception was not only based on a shrewd and intuitive kind of wisdom, it was a direct reflection of the man himself. He was instinctively modest, and he abhorred the idea of a private organization seeking power or credit for itself. It is... what? So he always capitalizes the word government, but he also abhors the idea of an organization, a private organization seeking power or credit for itself. I guess we're told governments are not private organizations, but come on. It is characteristic of his attitude that in laying down his plan of procedure at the very beginning of the hookworm campaign, he should write this sentence, quote, "The Commission will seek to hide itself behind its work and to keep to the front the local agencies through which the work is being done," end quote. It was at this period that Rose's unusual qualities of generalship and organizing ability became brilliantly clear. The extraordinary sweep of his vision and the compelling lucidity of his mind acted as a magnet to many men who later made substantial contributions to the leadership of the new public health movement that was beginning to develop around the world. Some of these men, indeed, became almost legendary figures in the saga of preventative medicine. For example, like Dr. Victor G. Heiser, whom Rose appointed as director of the board's work in the Far East, Dr. S.M. Lambert, who spent his life in Fiji, Samoa, and the Polynesian and Melanesian island chain, Dr. Wilbur A. Sawyer, who headed the activities in Australia, Dr. George K. Strode, who worked in Brazil, and others like Dr. John A. Farrell, Dr. Lewis W. Hackett, Dr. Charles N. Leach, and Dr. William P. Jacobs. These men and their many associates guided the far-flung enterprise on an ever-widening international front. As the campaign swept forward, experience and research brought new ideas to bear, and techniques were improved and often modified from country to country. It was found, for example, that a temperature as low as 50 degrees Fahrenheit checks larval development in the soil, and that an area which has such a minimum nightly temperature will not have a hookworm problem. Thus, in the mountainous areas of Ceylon, the disease is of little consequence, although the sea coast is heavily infected. It was found, too, that where the annual rainfall is less than 60 inches, as in most parts of Mexico, the disease does not gain a foothold because the prerequisite condition of moisture in the soil is lacking. But even when temperature and rainfall are favorable to larval development, The disease will not establish itself if the soil is unfavorable. Sandy and loam soils are required for the development of the larvae, which clay or silt soils will retard them. Thus, the disease is automatically limited to areas characterized by certain soil types. Contrary to expectations, the rice culture of the Far East does not lend itself to heavy hookworm infection, for although human excrement is used in fertilization, and the conditions are thus theoretically perfect for the development of the larvae, rice cultivation is carried on underwater and the hookworm ova are unable to develop. However, the mulberry tree workers in China, connected with the silk industry, where human excrement is also employed, are severely infected. Ooh, this is cheerful stuff, isn't it? Sometimes the new facts which developed had serious and discouraging implications. It was shown, for example, that the disease was spread by immigration. Every country importing native labor from India was bringing to its own soil a heavy stream of infection because India had an infection rate estimated between 60 and 80% of its entire population. In Assam, where 600 newly arrived Indian labourers were examined, only one was found free of the disease. In British Guiana, where workers from India were the chief source of labour supply, an examination of all immigrants arriving during the course of a year showed an average infection of 74%. By the importation of this kind of labour, the infection was also being carried into Dutch Guiana, Ceylon and Federated Malay States, the Straits Settlements and Java. The health authorities at San Francisco examined a shipload of Indian workers and found an infection of about 90%. Further immigration of this type was stopped, but every group of Indian laborers in the state became a center of infection from which the disease was spread. Well, that's not very PC, is it? Pointing out problems with immigration. Fosdick. You better be careful or you might get cancelled. As the work of the International Health Board developed around the world, it became customary in heavily infested tropical countries to dispense with individual examinations, and people were treated en masse without preliminary diagnosis. The plan was first tried out in Java and elsewhere in the Dutch East Indies, and was later put to extensive use in India and Siam. The primary reason for the adoption of this practice was the growing belief that in hookworm control, the essential thing was not so much to aim at the absolute cure of every infected person in the community, as it was quickly to remove the largest possible number of worms from the largest possible number of people, and thus to lower the severity of infection. But even this theory yielded to later ideas as new evidence was obtained. In his earlier days, Rose and his associates spoke of the eradication of hookworm. Indeed, the original Rockefeller Sanitary Commission used that word in its title. It is a goal that has never been reached. Social patterns and habits cannot be changed overnight, and discouraging reinfestation can occur where adequate sanitary arrangements are not maintained. Moreover, as the years went by, it began to be clear that there was a distinction between hookworm disease and a comparatively harmless hookworm infection. Oh, how about that? Laboratory investigation proved that people with a limited number of hookworms are not necessarily ill, and that a relative immunity can be acquired due to the presence of antibodies, in which an equilibrium is reached in the number of worms with little change thereafter, even with constant exposure to infective larvae. Consequently, the approach to the disease was altered over the years. Mass treatments have been largely discarded, and emphasis is now placed on steadily improving sanitary arrangements, with treatment limited to the individual sick person with enough worms to do appreciable damage. It cannot be said that hookworm infection has been wiped out. It can be said, however, that as a vast public menace around the world, it has been drastically limited and brought within manageable compass, so that it now joins the category of diseases like smallpox and typhoid, which modern public health methods can readily control. Dr. William H. Welch summed up the verdict in these words, quote, "The agency and the man were unique in the annals of preventative medicine, and in the light of subsequent developments and of the results achieved, they were of epochal significance in the history of the public health movement." End quote. I'll pause there and just have a quick look at the chat, because I've noticed it ticking away in the periphery of my vision there before we carry on with part 3. Oh, everybody's talking about worms. So Heidi's saying, David Patrick Harry, that's Church of the Eternal Logos, talks a lot about the solution of boundaries. Seed oils compromising our cellular integrity, and boundaries are limits are what makes life possible. Totally agree with you. Yeah, well said. Yeah, I agree with that. This is interesting about the worms. Upper class French women used to purposely eat worms to stay thin. Is that right, Heidi? What? That's mental. At least they look good, right? You know. Yeah, awesome. So just kind of reviewing, talking about puppies and dogs eating worms, eating grass and moss. Peter says, sounds like the Federal Reserve. Natural dewormer for dogs are dried rabbit ears with the fur on them. That is a useful tip. Gwen Weston, my dog passed now, got worms. It's easily cured though. Yeah. LJ is apologizing for going off topic. Don't worry about that. All good. It's nice to see things going on in the chat and people are throwing ideas back and forth and having a discussion. That's what it's all about, is get in the book, learn some stuff, and then have a conversation about it. It's perfect. I love it. This is exactly what I'm doing this for. But yeah, very interesting chapter. Very, just, I don't know. What's the quote? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Somebody said something like that. That's what I'm getting from this, is a very much kind of like, oh, they found a problem. They convinced everyone there was a problem, and then they went out and did a treatment for everybody. And then at the end, it was like, oh, it turns out you can have this, but not have any symptoms or it be a problem. Oops. After we've rolled out our treatment to everybody. Anyway, let's carry on. Part 3. Ever present in Rosa's mind was the conception that the attack on hookworm was important, not so much because it was a disabling disease, but rather because it lent itself so readily to purposes of demonstration in disease control. It was an advanced agent of preventative medicine. It served at once as an end in itself and as a convenient means to a larger end. In its nature, causes and cure, it was easily understood by the average citizen, and its effects upon his own health and the health of his community were plainly demonstrable. When he had seen this one disease treated and brought under control, he was prepared to support the control of other diseases that were less simple and less tangible. That is a very important sentence right there. Moreover, the same sanitary patterns and type of organization required for hookworm control were usable and necessary in relation to other endemics. Wear shoes and use toilets. And don't use human waste to fertilize your plants. Basically, what it boils down to is just better sanitary conditions and hygiene, isn't it? Hookworm in the south lived side by side with malaria, another anemia-producing disease which had disastrous personal and social consequences. Rose found that malaria was responsible for more sickness and death than all other diseases combined. It was particularly prevalent among children, and therefore preyed most heavily upon human beings during the period of physical and mental growth. As early as 1915, therefore, Rose began a series of experimental projects to determine the degree to which malaria could be controlled within the limits of reasonable expenditure and under conditions prevailing in typical farm districts in the South. Once he had proved to his own satisfaction that simple anti-mosquito measures could sharply reduce the incidence of the disease at a cost well within the means of the average community, he began to dream of the possibility of a broad application of preventive measures. Malaria is perhaps the greatest handicap to the welfare and economic efficiency of the human race. Well, I don't know if malaria gets that title, or the parasitic class of cowards that have themselves firmly lodged on our necks is actually more of a handicap, but that's just my personal opinion. Malaria is perhaps the greatest handicap to the welfare and economic efficiency of the human race. Notice economic efficiency. I noticed that word popped up earlier, didn't it, in the other chapter about how they want to. What was the context again? It was like we need to prevent anything that gets in the way of human efficiency. And that's a little tell as well about how they view the general sort of population of the world as units of production, as servants, as slaves, as people to be exploited and used as workers. In other words, we've got to keep them efficient, right? Malaria is perhaps the greatest handicap to the welfare and economic efficiency of the human race. To Rose and his associates, it seemed probable that the same worldwide pattern of attack involving demonstration and education, which was being employed against hookworm, could be made on this other disease. 5 years of constantly widening work in the United States paved the way for the implementation of this conception, and in the period that followed, a boldly conceived and executed malaria program was projected around the globe. Tuberculosis was another widespread malady which Rose encountered in the South, and when, in 1917, a marked increase in the disease developed in France due to war conditions, the International Health Board was ready to accept the invitation of the French government to lead the campaign against it. The plan of operations was basically the same as the plan against hookworm, a preliminary statistical survey to determine the incidence of the disease, the establishment of dispensaries, and the carrying out of a broad campaign of popular education. This is not an impertinent importation of scientific knowledge into the land of Louis Pasteur, wrote Dr. Vincent, but rather a demonstration of method and of organized teamwork. Similarly, with yellow fever, which is discussed in a subsequent chapter, the apprehension which the threat of this disease created in the southern states led ultimately to activities which embraced 3 continents. Rose's thinking was invariably on a global scale. Definitely. A technique once developed had to be projected wherever it was needed. When it came to preventive medicine, flags and boundary lines had no validity. That's 2020 all over. That's the last 4 years all over. When it comes to preventive medicine, flags and boundary lines had no validity. Yeah, it raises red flags when the whole world, every nation in the world agrees on something and they all act in tandem, in unison. And you want to tell me there's no plan or scheming afoot for a one world government? I would say it's probably already here in many ways. Quote, unless public health is conceived in international terms, Rose insisted, the strategic opportunity of our generation will be lost. To the early pioneers of the International Health Board, the phrase, the well-being of mankind throughout the world, which was written into the charter and engraved on the seal of the Rockefeller Foundation, was a living and beckoning symbol. Interesting. It never occurred to me that this book would be so... it shouldn't be the Rockefeller Foundation, but it's more like the Divock Foundation. It's the foundation of the Divock situation that we've all lived through. Okay, 4. But from the beginning, Rose was after bigger game than hookworm or malaria or any other malady. The attack on these diseases was for him an entering wedge, a method by which states and nations could be induced to build up permanent machinery to take care of the whole problem of public health. This was his constant preoccupation from the day he first accepted responsibility of leadership, and he drove toward this goal with his characteristic tenacity. He was not content with the elimination or control of a particular disease. Unless this type of activity served to demonstrate the necessity of adequate public health organizations supported by taxation, the results would be superficial and ephemeral. Underlying all efforts to protect people from hookworm or malaria or tuberculosis, there must be official agencies set up on a full-time basis, staffed with thoroughly trained men and equipped with modern facilities. This was what Rose was driving at. He wanted the International Health Board to leave behind it, wherever it went, not only an awakened public consciousness and a growing belief in the fundamental need for preventive measures, but a determination and an ability to build the necessary machinery by which modern methods of sanitation and medical care could be enforced. There, he wants to force it. That's an interesting moral question, isn't it? Like forcing people to be sanitary. It must be remembered that when Rose began his activities, public health work not only in America but elsewhere throughout the world was relatively undeveloped. although in this respect Great Britain and Germany were far ahead of the United States, not only in terms of practice but in terms of knowledge. The science of preventive medicine was crude and rudimentary. Except for smallpox, there was little that could be done in the face of epidemics like cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and malaria. Boards of health were beginning to appear in the South, following their appearance elsewhere, but they were largely paper organizations made up of physicians who served without pay. Appropriations for their work were usually so small as to make any effective action impossible. There was no permanent staff and little attempt at program. Conditions in rural areas were particularly lamentable, and while most of the states had provided for country boards of health or county health officers, there were no funds for their work, and they functioned only in times of epidemic, if at all. To Rose, this was the root of the problem. Unless this could be corrected, any beneficial results of the work on a private agency would endure only so long as the private agency was in the field. Beginning in 1916, therefore, the International Health Board undertook the systematic development and support of county health organizations in the United States. Practical demonstrations had already shown that for the task of providing adequate health protection for rural communities, the county was the most effective unit of organization, except in those parts of the country where the governmental unit is the township. The 1916 experiment began with 10 counties in North Carolina, and the idea spread rapidly not only through the South, but in other parts of the nation as well. It involved for each unit a full-time public health staff, consisting as a minimum of a physician as health officer, a sanitary inspector, a public health nurse, and an office assistant. For the support of the undertaking, the county itself guaranteed 50% of the cost, the balance being met by the State Board of Health and the International Health Board, generally in equal proportions at first, but with the board withdrawing its support when the experiment was successfully launched. Seldom did the board's share of the expense exceed $2,500 a year, and rarely, if ever, did the probationary period extend beyond 3 years. Pump priming, Rose used to call this kind of activity, and he often used the homely simile of the farmer's half bucket of water to start the pump whose leather washer had dried out. A half bucket of water that made possible a continuous flow from a deep and copious reservoir. I'll give it to him. Like, Fosdick is actually a pretty good writer. I mean, I enjoy the flow, and he puts together some nice phrases that are fun to read, and I actually find Fosdick's writing a little easier to read live than some of Colin Simpson's writing in Lusitania. Like, I was tripping up over some of those sentences. They were a bit hard to get my mouth around. Certainly in the case of county health organization, Rose's half bucket of water had extraordinary consequences. The idea was developed in hundreds of countries in the United States, and the International Health Board projected it around the world. In the municipios of Puerto Rico, Brazil, and the Philippine Islands, the Bezirk of Austria, the Département of France, and the districts of the Strait Settlements, Long after Rose retired from the leadership of the board in 1923, this type of support was continued as the idea of local responsibility for public health functions gained headway on an international scale. When the International Health Board withdrew from what was, after all, merely the demonstration of a practical and effective method, it had appropriated over $4 million for the purpose. Today, the method is taken for granted, and full-time rural health service has become an accepted fact. It has been adopted in most of the states of America, for example, and the quality of service has improved to such a degree that many rural areas enjoy as adequate a system of health supervision as do the large municipalities. Concurrently with the development of county units, the International Health Board stimulated the growth and evolution of state and national health services. Here again, the conception behind the activity was the conception of pump priming, where financial assistance was given. It was with the understanding that legislative appropriations would be secured to cover the cost of the work after a brief period. On this principle, such divisions as sanitary engineering, vital statistics, and epidemiology were added to many state health departments, and central public health laboratories were developed where diagnoses could be made of diseases like tuberculosis, typhoid fever, malaria, and diphtheria. I just want to pause there a second on this word, epidemiology. That was a huge enabler of the great Big C event, the Great Scam of 2020. Epidemiologists, that as a discipline, as a practice, is, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong about this, but what I've heard, what my understanding is, they go out and they survey people and they ask them questions and they gather all that data that was surveyed and then they produce some sort of report or response or analysis about what should happen. Now, this is a process that's fraught with problems. People have bad memories, they're unreliable, they might lie. Just asking people to fill out a survey, a questionnaire, you can weight the questions in a certain way and lead them down certain avenues. So epidemiology as a discipline, I don't think is quite the most reliable way of gathering public health information and data. But I could be corrected if I'm wrong about that. But it's just interesting here that they had a part to play in rolling out epidemiology. It says was added to many state health departments. So that word just stood out to me there. I'd be interested to hear what you got to say about that in the chat, which I will check at the end of this section. As in all activities which Rose undertook, this type of aid was extended around the world and in more than 40 countries in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. So we're seeing here this. This is literally the Divok Foundation. This is getting all these countries all around the world to approach health in exactly the same way. And it's interesting, and I'm looking forward to the section about China. It's interesting that he came back from China and was like, yeah, we definitely got to invest in Chinese medicine because they probably saw it as their main competitor. This is the rollout of the allopathic medical paradigm, which the whole Divok event would not have been possible unless we'd all been indoctrinated into this allopathic paradigm of health and this germ theory and this symptom management with pharmaceuticals. And not to mention the fact that many modern pharmaceuticals are created from oil processing waste, and Rockefellers are into oil. And then they switch and pivot into public health, and they roll out this public health paradigm all over the world, epidemiology in all these different places. Yeah, fantastic and interesting, and I'm enjoying this. But I completely lost my place. Oh yeah, more than 40 countries in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. A demonstration was given of the necessary components that constitute the rapidly developing science of preventive medicine. Vital statistics in Colombia, public health laboratories in Costa Rica and the Philippines, a hygienic institute in Hungary, a statistical bureau in Bulgaria, a laboratory in Peking for producing biological products. These are random samples of the sweep and scope of the work. It was this creative concern, this imaginative type of activity that Rose had in mind when he voiced his frequently repeated aphorism, quote, "Constructive thinking results from action, and to action must return for its final criticism," end quote. Well, that's a catchy aphorism, isn't it, Rose? Constructive thinking results from action, and to action must return for its final criticism. Okay, I think I kind of get what he's saying, but it's not very catchy. Quick review of the chat. What is going on here? WHO, WEF, yeah. Peter saying, let us take care of you. That's what it's like, isn't it? We know what's best for every single person in the world. The skeleton of the One World Gov is already formed, and now they're putting muscle on it. Heidi, that's a really good metaphor. Yeah, it's a really good metaphor. Heidi says, epidemiology has allowed for our disastrous nutrition recommendations. Yeah. It's upside down, isn't it? The whole food pyramid. Peter says, I've got friends in the business, which means I've got the paperwork on gain of function since day one. tried to warn everyone, including my own children, how some have injuries, and now some have injuries. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Peter. But protect, make copies of that paperwork and protect it and make sure it's not destroyed. Preserved is what it's all about. Preserving these informations, getting these informations. I've been speaking for too long. Preserving this information, getting it on the record, putting it in a place where other people can review it and revisit it and learn from it in future, right? So, yeah, I think we did make a good choice here with this book for sure. All right, part 5, and then, we've got about 40 pages to go. 5. Rose had not gone very far in his work before he began to realize that the bottleneck was not so much a lack either of money or of organization as it was a lack of trained men. The idea that any physician qualified to practice could act as a health officer, giving part of his time to official duties, was an anachronism. Special qualifications and special training in the theoretical and practical aspects of public health administration were fast becoming necessary if preventive medicine was to keep abreast with modern conditions. As early as 1914, Rose, with the enthusiastic backing of Dr. Buttrick, Dr. Simon Flexner, and Dr. Welch, began to develop the idea of a school of public health. At a conference attended by 19 leading physicians and educators, with Mr. Gates in the chair, Rose made a statement which Dr. Welch admitted later deeply stirred him. In consequence, Rose and Welch were appointed a committee to prepare a report, and Rose outlined his understanding of the conference in these words, quote, The discussion seemed to develop substantial agreement on the following points. 1. That a fundamental need in the public health service in this country at the present time is of men adequately trained for the work. 2. That a distinct contribution towards meeting this need could be made by establishing at some convenient place a school of public health of high standard. 3. That such an institution, while maintaining its separate identity and autonomy, should in the interest both of economy and efficiency be closely affiliated with a university and its medical school. 4. That the nucleus of this school of public health should be an institute of hygiene. 5. That a plan for this institute should be formulated with a view to its beginning, not on the scale of its ultimate character, but rather on that of its minimum requirements. That it should be given opportunity to grow within its own sphere as an institute of hygiene and to expand into full stature as a school of public health by drawing upon the medical school, the school of engineering, and the other departments of the university, and by utilizing, for purposes of demonstration and practical experience, all the facilities of the City and State Department of Health and of the U.S. Public Health Service. End quote. As a result of these deliberations, the Rockefeller Foundation built and endowed the School of Hygiene and Public Health at Johns Hopkins University, which was opened in 1918 with Dr. William H. Welch as director, requiring of its students courses which included bacteriology, biostatistics, epidemiology, sanitary engineering, and public health administration. Boom, there you go. I mean, no terrain theory listed in there, is there? They're going down this is the germ theory route right there. Bacteriology, that's the germ theory route. And epidemiology, it's that nonsense science that we mentioned earlier. And public health administration. So it's also training people to be bureaucrats, to be the ones who enforce the box ticking exercises and the use of this dodgy data produced by the epidemiology based on this faulty paradigm of germs and bacteria and bacteriology. So it's all there, and now they're training people and indoctrinating them into this worldview so they can roll it out everywhere in order to lay the groundwork for a fake worldwide danpemic, let's call it. See, I've been talking to Nigel now. I'm coming up with my own code words. It provided, for the first time in America, a thorough training for full-time public health officers in states, cities, and rural areas, as well as for those preparing to enter the United States Public Health Service. The West Point of public health, Dr. Vincent called it. But other West Points soon became necessary, And this pioneering step was followed by a somewhat similar gift to Harvard in 1912. Thereafter, Rose and his successors as head of the International Health Board undertook the implementation of a bold and creative plan literally to girdle the globe with schools and institutes of public health, including public health nursing. Girdle the globe. I mean, what is a girdle? A girdle is like a corset, isn't it? Isn't it something it's something you constrict? You tie it, you squeeze. A girdle is not a good thing, but they're saying right here, this is the plan. This is what they're doing. A bold and creative plan, literally to girdle the globe with schools and institutes of public health, including public health nursing. Wow. Some were new organizations that were built from the ground up. Others were developed or supported with substantial subsidies. The schools and institutes were located in Prague, Warsaw, London, Toronto, Copenhagen, Budapest, Oslo, Belgrade, Zagreb, Madrid, Cluj? I've never heard of that place before. Ankara, Sofia, Rome, Tokyo, Athens, Bucharest, Stockholm, Calcutta, Manila, Sao Paulo, and the University of Michigan. Over $25 million was spent in this gigantic undertaking, with consequences in terms of the improvement of public health around the world that are beyond reckoning. That is true. Absolutely true. The consequences are beyond reckoning at this point. To make this new educational machinery doubly effective, Rose and his associates developed a system of fellowships by which promising students were brought to these institutes for graduate training. The students were selected with scrupulous care with reference to their fitness for important posts as scientists, teachers, or practical administrators in the public health service. Fitness for important posts as scientists, teachers, or so, like let's take for example Ted Ross. He had a certain fitness for that important post, didn't he, in the WHO? So it's just very interesting the way they word these things. Their fitness for important posts, to which in most cases they had a definite assurance of appointment on completion of their courses. So they're being groomed, in other words. They're being told they're being handpicked. This reminds me a little bit of like the Cecil Rhodes scholarships, the recruitment from Oxford and the young men there into the ranks of the Milner's kindergarten and the roundtable groups and the meetings. It's a kind of a grooming, isn't it? And training and investing in people, and then you've kind of got them under your control at that point. The system embraced nearly every country in the world, and students were brought from Czechoslovakia and Brazil and Ceylon, for example, to study at Johns Hopkins or the London School of Tropical Medicine or the Pasteur Institute. So Louis Pasteur, father of germ theory, and a bit of a dodgy character, if I'm not mistaken. I have a couple of books on Pasteur, Béchamp or Pasteur. Béchamp was the scientist who was advocating for terrain theory. Pasteur got pushed to the forefront and celebrated and lauded and given awards and all this kind of stuff. He is the man who the process of pasteurization is named after. But actually it turns out that pasteurized milk is not as good for you as unpasteurized, unhomogenized milk, raw milk in other words, because that bacteria that is in that milk is beneficial and has a whole host of positive health benefits. Because as you know, we are walking colonies. We have microorganisms in our skin, on us and in us. Every pore, every part of our body has its own little flora of microorganisms, and if they weren't there, we wouldn't exist as human beings, right? The organism of the human wouldn't function without that population of microorganisms. So to sell this lie to people that we need to pasteurize the milk, we need to kill the milk so there's nothing living in it, and that's better for you. Absolute con. And if I'm not mistaken, it was one of the only times that Rothschild spoke and gave a speech in Parliament, Lord Rothschild, was to advocate for the pasteurization of milk. I've read that somewhere. I have no idea where, and it could be just fake news. but I can believe it. I can definitely believe it. So, little side tangent there. Moreover, Men who were already trained as public health officers and teachers were given an opportunity for postgraduate work or refresher courses at some appropriate institute. Rose was anxious to tie these centers of public health and education together. It was part of a broad conception that as these new schools developed, they could be made to stimulate and reinforce each other by interchange of experience, facilities, and men. A migration of public health personnel back and forth across national boundary lines would be an enriching experience by which the new ideas and techniques of one area could become the common property of all. There you are. Look at that. The common property of all. Public health on a global scale. The now that you as the individual, you need to serve the common property of all, the common public health that is common to everybody on the face of the earth. Rose thus initiated a fellowship program, which later was adopted by the other divisions of the foundation and became, over the years, perhaps the most important aspect of its work. It was an investment in leadership and underwriting of promising talent. As one looks back on this initial period in the history of the Rockefeller Foundation, the genius of Wycliffe Rose seems to loom above the horizon of his contemporaries. Certainly he was one of the most intriguing figures of his generation. He was so modest and even shy that it is difficult to realize that he was also, in Dr. Welch's phrase, the groundbreaker in this global attack on disease. Perhaps one of the secrets of his distinguished success lay in his urge to seek advice. As Dr. Wilbur A. Sawyer, who knew him well, says of him, quote, "He took advice from authorities everywhere regarding all phases of his program. He went around the world visiting health officials and collecting suggestions," end quote. As one sums up his career, the tribute paid to him at his death becomes him well. In the heroic age of public health, he was one of the giants. Did I skip a page there? No, I didn't. It just didn't seem to flow. I was like, who's this guy that he's talking about suddenly? Okay, that's the end of chapter 3. And the next chapter is the broadening program in public health. But whoa, that was good. I enjoyed that one a lot. I didn't expect some of the associations, and I'm going to start referring to this book as the Divok Foundation, because it is laying the foundation to make the whole Divok experience possible. So how about that? I'm going to have a quick review of the comments right after this sip. I thought those 2 chapters were very revealing and interesting. I'm going to post a link to Entropy Stream as well in the chat. Now, there might be, I think, at that link, the possibility to do a super chat. If you feel so inclined, that would be lovely. But more, I just want to see if the function works. So if anyone can feel up for sending me a couple of quid via that link to see if it works, that would be cool. No problem if not, though. No pressure. What have we got going on here then? Yeah, Peter. So LJ is talking about the mentioning of gain of function, thinking about Fauci. Where's he disappeared to? He'll just be flying around the world getting paid tens of thousands of dollars for giving speeches that are written by someone else, probably. Peter says he's probably in a bunker in New Zealand. Yeah, this is part of the problem, is that nobody's been held accountable or arrested for the whole Divok, the whole event. Nobody's. So the possibility, the likelihood is they might roll out another one and do it again, because they're certainly not allowing anybody to be held accountable or arrested. They're not. That's not happening, is it, on any scale? Even Rainer Fulmich's whole collection and gathering of data and evidence and information, that doesn't seem to have led to anything that sort of petered out. So that kind of suggests that they might just try and do it all again. But if we can spread more awareness and information about, these kind of books and the faulty paradigm of germ theory, we got a chance of making people less likely to acquiesce and go along with the nonsense if they do try and roll it out again. LJ says, read about Beauchamp. Not sure about spelling. Bechamp. Adamski says Bechamp. Yeah. I think I got one up there. Bechamp and Pasteur. Yeah, there it is. One sec. So this is the one I've got. I haven't read it yet. I'm really going for authors who are dead, just to decrease the likelihood of my copyright strikes or any of that kind of thing. I don't know about Ethel Hume. I don't know if she's still with us or not. But this is a lost chapter in the history of biology. This was first published in 1923. So maybe she's not with us anymore. And maybe that means we could probably get away with reading this one through. But I think this would be another very good, this might be a good one to go for off the back of this one. Because I certainly need to get more well-read on these kind of topics and issues, that's for sure. Peter is talking about more Roman than Rome. Antoine Béchamp Adamski says, yeah, you got it. You nailed it. LJ says, does anyone wonder why we are the only species that drinks another species' milk? I've heard that said before, but don't cats drink milk and dogs? I think cats and dogs will also drink cow milk. Adamski says, interested in that book. Terrain theory seems like something I should know about. Yes, you and me both. That is why it's on my shelf. So hopefully we will get around to that at some point, one day. So thank you very much. I think that is it for tonight. We've done a good 2 hours, 20 minutes there, but very interesting chapter. And one of the things that I really like about reading these books, and especially having you guys here with me, is it can be a little bit boring sometimes. It can be a little bit tedious, but then every now and again you get to that little nugget and some quote or something stands out, and then you're kind of like, ooh, and it's almost like that's the rewarding bit. So we're kind of mining through this information, looking for these little quotes that are revealing to us the way the world works and the things that happened in the past that got us to where we are today. Sometimes there's some kind of bits that drag on or aren't so particularly engaging, but I think tonight we had that good experience of, we persisted and then towards the end of that last chapter there, we were really getting some good nuggets and good insights into things. So I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. So let's wrap it up there. I'm thinking about doing a Sunday morning as my next one. I think Friday nights are going to be regular. That'll be the regular drum beat. And then with the occasional, maybe Wednesday or Sunday in and around that. If I can wangle it, I'll try and do that. So I'm hoping for Sunday morning, maybe early Sunday morning before everyone wakes up. So don't worry if you can't make it there live, but there might be something else for you to catch up on during the week before Friday. So let's wrap it up there. Thank you very much for being here again. Deep gratitude for everybody being here live and anybody watching on the replay. All the links for support and all that stuff is in the description. You know about all that stuff. I don't need to keep saying it. So take it easy. Look after yourselves and each other. Have a lovely weekend. It's Friday night. So Saturday and Sunday ahead, a whole 48 hours to spend wisely. And I hope you enjoy yourself, whatever you do. Spend some time with loved ones. Maybe call that elderly relative you haven't seen for a while, or maybe that estranged sibling or cousin you haven't talked to for a while, and just reach out to people, because we're all in this together, whether we like it or not. So with that said, I will leave it there. God bless.